Hi, this is Kayang. Today I'll present a speech on James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man about the historical backgrounds and how it could be understood in a Althusserian perspective. First, let's examine the historical context in which the work was written and formulate a hypothesis that will be justified throughout my presentation. I assume that many of you might have been quite startled by the dense historical details throughout the novel, so I've organized a brief background information slide to let you all informed. Since James Joyce himself had been heavily influenced by the socio-political status of Ireland, it is more than necessary to know the particular historical context of the time. Note that Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's persona, lives through his creator's contemporary. The novel and the prime years of James Joyce commonly takes place during the Irish War of Independence, which began in 1890 and lasted for about 30 years. Ireland fights for independence after the Irish famine and outer consistent apostasy of the dominant British Parliament. This causes conflict not only between the Irish versus the British, but also between the different cleavage groups within Ireland. Yet mostly this conflict had been between the majority of the Catholic Irish who favoured Irish independence and the Protestant minority until the death of the Irish nationalist Charles Parnell. Parnell might be a familiar name to all of us since he is a very frequently mentioned in a portrait of the artist as a young man. Being the most prized Irish nationalist and parliament member of Britain, Parnell was one of the most avid leaders to spread the movement for Irish self-governance, earning the nickname the Uncrowned King of Ireland. Yet conflict breaks out when Parnell dies after his affair with a married woman is revealed. His death greatly impacted the independence movement, and the Catholic Church, which had been the center of the movement, is blamed for having caused his death, as they had condemned Parnell for his obscenities. Being born around this time of tumult, Joyce also seems to have blamed the Catholic Church, as we can so vividly see the morbid atmosphere depicted in the initial pages of the work. This conflict is likely to have dismantled one of the core authorities in the independence movement, resolving the war into the Irish submission to the British Parliament. Ultimately, 1900 is when both James Joyce and his fictional persona find inspiration to complete his masterpiece. After the Irish Home Rule was built in the British Parliament, which substantially put Ireland under British control without effective amendments, fury among the Irish public broke out again during this period. Intellectuals like university students were especially fierce participants, breaking out into protests and ferocious campaigns. We can also find this in our reading, where Stephen is involved with a group of university students who are striving for Irish independence. As for Joyce, who belonged to the literary field, he also faced suggestions to participate in writing in Gaelic and inheriting the Irish folklore, such as Yeats, to revive the national tradition and works of literature which he despised. The content was mutual, as many Irish writers also condemned Joyce for sticking to modern European writing styles rather than trying to preserve the Irish spirit. This eventually led to Joyce's exile to Trieste as an English teacher as he found no hope in his nation. As if to express great antinomy towards this incident, Stephen Dedalus in our story provides us an interesting but quite long speech on his ideas on aesthetics and the wrongdoings of contemporary literary literature that, which will be further discussed afterwards, but for to make a long story short, prioritizes art for art's sake. This reminds us of a popular opinion of James Joyce. Is he truly an indifferent writer who denied being involved in a political tumult in his own birthplace and pursued writing elaborate yet elitist and otherworldly works? Well, after reading this novel, my hypothesis is that he was not, but rather he was ahead of his time and criticizing society as a whole, a true anti-imperialist who would even consider a torchbearer for the later Marxists such as Ulrich Althusser. Not only did Joyce frequently identify himself with Ireland both in the novel and in his speeches, but he also maintained intimate connections with the Irish nationalist writers such as Yeats. This in itself is not a strong opinion, but needs to be mentioned because the novel we will analyze is deeply connected with Joyce's personal life. For now, let us start with a little less prejudice toward James Joyce and a slightly favorable hypothesis of mine that as an aesthete and a patriot, Joyce wanted to discuss politics while also preserving artistic virtue uninhibited by adhesion to political activities. Before the main analysis, let me briefly explain the key series of Marxist criticism that I will be using: ideological state apparatus and interpellation. First of all, ISA, or ideological state apparatus, is a term coined by a French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, and refers to institutions that indoctrinate individuals according to the dominant ideology at a subconscious level. A good example would be schools or religious institutions where there is a clear hierarchical authority that continuously inserts you certain ideas and values of life autonomously. The ISA is often paired with the RSA, or the repressive state apparatus, that uses physical coercion and visible threat to make an individual submit to the authority, but usually these apparatuses complement each other, even hybrid within a social environment. And how exactly do the mechanisms of ISA work? The theory of interpolation, or to call, answers this question. Althusser explains that ideology hails the nameless individual, so they're given a social name to which they would perform the given responsibilities in response. Such performance bearing will lead to the subsequent internalization of the dominant ideology. This, as illustrated, has to do with the formation of the individual identity and gives us the idea that the modern individual can never exist alone or outside the structure. Therefore, as long as we are, we cannot escape from the structure. This is surprisingly the central premise of post structuralism or any other subversive theory after the introduction of structuralism, which thus foreshadows that Joyce's longing to stray from the oppressive Irish reality entirely might not be resolved as well. Now that we have gone through the key concepts of our theory, let us finally leap to the analysis. I'm sure that most of you would have connected the lines between Althusser and Joyce already, but to specify my trail of reading, I would like to focus on how Stephen Dedalus, as an individual who, like all others, had been submissive to the ideological state apparatus, temporarily escapes the oppressive structure thanks to his dedication to art. By such plot and rhetoric, Joyce so eloquently explains the structural injustice of a society that had been overlooked in the frenzy of revolution and calls for a more fundamental change. As many of you have guessed, the most influential but not the only ideological state apparatus we can see in this novel is the Clongowes College, a Jesuit boarding school that ceaselessly puts Stephen into question and suffering. Since Stephen's youth, Clongowes College has served as a moral ruler that defines and shapes Stephen's perspective on the world. For example, the children are given a somewhat didactic lecture at the First Communion must be a person's happiest day of life by the story of Napoleon. Although this example might seem a bit too typical, Stephen finds the information of the military giant to be rather impressive. He internalizes the idea that communion must be the happiest day of his life as well. Also, we can see the incident that even in the pettiest homework of writing his address, Stephen subconsciously scales his residence in accordance with the distance relative to God. Hierarchy is also clearly embedded here, as the same page denotes. It was because he was allowed because a priest would know what a sin was and would not do it. That was called the order, and he had heard his father say that they were all clever men. Here Stephen shows an almost blind sense of faith that the clergymen are never wrong, thus identifying the omniscience of God with the priests. If God in religion is equivalent to ideology itself, then those in power have successfully iterated their authority to ideology itself. Another aspect of the ideological state apparatus that is very interesting in this novel is that Joyce employs an interesting idea of the mixture of the ideological and repressive apparatus, where corporal punishment and threats of eternal damnation coexist, thus naturally inducing the Foucauldian notion of bodily discipline and the disciplinary power to dominate Stephen. As most fictional works mainly focus on one particular means of control of the authority, it could be said that this meticulous description of the corrupt and unjust religious institution provided an incredibly insightful critique on the Catholic Church at this time. The rather insignificant internalization of the church gradually climaxes to the point where Stephen is afflicted with massive guilt during the Mass at the church as he defines his life to be sinful and humiliating in the eyes of religion. Note that while the initial fear instigated by the church had been quite straightforward and even physically threatening, the warrant for doomsday and wrath of God is the most abstract fear one could possibly imagine. Because Stephen does not want to discourage God, he starts to abstain himself and goes through arduous series of self-sufferings. While most of the Bildungsroman would have considered this to be a fruitful development, such behaviors are subjects of criticism, the last hurdle that must be overcome by the individual to free oneself from the discipline-oriented life. Keep in mind that when Stephen is involved in a quarrel among his university mates, he most avidly describes an adhesion to a certain set of beliefs or popular isms as iconoclastic. Only by understanding that one had fallen into the snares of dedication and admitting that to live is to live by mortal sin can one truly awaken oneself as an artist, which Stephen does. In this sense, his development is inversely accomplished by breaking the ritualistic realm and being able to overlook all the oppressive structures alike. While Stephen's initial criticism on Marxism might have been an indicator to his opposition to it, it is he who truly least treads the spirit of Marxist ideology at the dawn of post-structuralism. Thus, in this logic, it is only after Stephen experiences life outside the college and of the political reality that his family faces. Thus, in this logic, it is only after Stephen experiences life outside the college and of the political reality that his family faces that he is motivated to escape from such structure. Surprisingly enough, Joyce is once again introducing a radical idea that unsuits his pessimistic commentary on Irish politics, as he is suggesting the introduction of other ideas that could possibly subvert the existing structure to end the ills of the corrupt ISA. The following response of the authority, this fellow has heresy in his essay, or the teachings that Byron has for the uneducated, is a response and reflection of how the religious community of Ireland had reprimanded Joyce of his beliefs, further extending the possibility that Joyce indeed was politically active and willing in his own way. Contextually, the instant reprimanding and stigmatizing of an unconsolidated individual casts the immense threat concealed within the institution. What I personally found to be brilliant in this novel was that, although this novel is full of Joyce's beliefs and commentary on society, he has not written a dreadfully long piece of manifesto, but a truly literary piece of work. By analyzing two of the most impressive themes used for such effect, I would like to invite everyone to evaluate Joyce's political and literary essays in a more radical perspective. The first theme that we are to see is quite obvious if you are aware of the title of our novel, the shifting images of the portraiture. As far as I have counted well, there are six images of portraits that are depicted in the critical moments of Stephen's life, which are terrifyingly closely related to the notion of Stephen's identity. As many of the late modernist novels themed on the faces of the portrait of the individual, such as Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, these portraits are direct symbols of the protagonist's outlook of themselves. Thus, by using a rather popular trope, Joyce deliberately emphasizes to follow the subtle flow of these portraits. The descriptions regarding the first portrait are to be seen at Christmas at the Diddler's house, depicted to be amongst the red holly and green ivy round the old portraits on the walls, and lovely. Amongst the festivity of the holidays, the image predicts the anticipation of a nostalgic family reunion and of intimate gatherings. The prediction is instantly followed by the introduction to the Diddler's precedent that he was a good Irishman when there was no money in the job. He was condemned to death as a white boy, but he had a saying about our clerical friends that he would never let one of them put his 2 feet under his mahogany. This excerpt indicates the dark side to the seemingly jolly Irish family and how the clerical class had been exploiting this public as such. Yet, as young Stephen too is deeply embedded within the ideologies of Catholicism at this moment, he too is absorbed and framed within the familial and Irish theme. Albeit there are opposers to this unjust tradition, the public fury is still pertained in peace, muffled by the overwhelming spirit of Christmas. Meager and somewhat suffocating, the first portraiture is an excellent overview of the exploited Irish household. The second portrait is found when young Stephen contemplates the efficacy of Catholicism, perhaps for the first time. Odd enough, the portrait of a medieval religious figure dwells within the closeted area visited by many, just as the religion itself possesses both the private and public sectors of life. And although the portrait is infiltrated with scribbles and mindless tomboys, it is a much more substantial figure than the portrait of the Daedalus man, which is quite meaningful considering how it's much older than the recent dead old man. Although young Stephens questions the significance of religion time to time, and although religion seems to be a rather peripheral portion of the rebellious town children's idleness, it is in fact most firmly grounded in such a banality of everyday life. The third portraiture to follow is a more significant symbol of the individual's subordination to institution, where you will be able to spot Stephen in the novel heading to the rector's room to report injustice practiced by the prefect. Please be aware of this following description. Portraits of the saints and great men of the order who were looking down on him silently as he passed, Saint Ignatius Loyola holding an open book and pointing to the words Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam in it, Saint Francis Xavier pointed to his chest, Lorenzo Ricci with his biretta on his head like one of the prefects of the lines, the three patrons of Holy Use, Saint Stanislaus Kostka, Saint Aloysius Gonzago, and Blessed John Birchmans, all with young faces because they died when they were young, and Father Peter Kenny sitting in a chair wrapped in a big cloak. Note that Stephen perceives the portraits to be a ghastly and looming figure. He passes by these figures Initially unsure of what he sees, as he is greatly mortified by the idea of speaking to the one in the supreme authority and is doubly overwhelmed by the images of the grand saints. If the first two portraits have been at least partially worn out by time, invaded by the scribbles and gazes of the audience, the portraits of the rector room are the ones that appropriate the gaze, looking down at the lowly people and remaining as the ideally created visions of the institution itself. From this point, the pressure of the institution finds substance. The portrait serves as a medium to crystallize the invisible impression. The fourth and the fifth portraiture can be seen as the rondo of a contrast between the reigning Irish public and the firm Catholic instasis. What's significant here is that yet both of the portraitures are now brief sketches that skims along the mind of the artist Stephen. The waiting figure of Uncle Charles gives a pastoral but archaic view of the Irish public that Stephen is now able not to be overwhelmed, and the solemn and duly comforting portrait displayed at the Clongowes College also does not play a role in Stephen's decision to leave the vocation of priesthood that was suggested by the supreme authority. See how the painting styles have changed over time, and now the old art has been separated from Stephen as the viewer. It is not that the Irish and religious identity is no longer valid in him, but that now he can share gazes equally with the portraiture and objectivize his stances on the status quo. The sixth portraiture is, as we follow the previously discussed Joyce's trajectory of escaping the structure, the most passing image yet quite pivotal. It's not even proper portrait after all, as Stephen merely spots the countenance of his mate Cranley in a portrait-like vision. As you can see, in this excerpt. Why was it that when he thought of Cranley, he could never raise before his mind the entire image of his body, but only the image of his head and face? Even now, against the grey curtain of the morning, he saw before him, like the phantom of a dream, the face of his severed head or death mask, crowned on the brows by a stiff black upright hair as by an iron crown. This portrait emerges from Stephen's inability to see Cranley as a whole, only as a daunting, phantasmatic figure. Yet one could even say that this image is even comical due to his caricatural style, and I found this to be quite deliberate. Throughout the novel, Cranley depicts the archetypical image of a head for student revolutionary which Joyce had greatly dissented, an heir to the static Irish tradition, an unquestioned face to ideology, not a one-piece person to reflect and act, but a reactionary chimera of the time. He is greatly objectified by the now allegedly conscious artist Stephen, and is presented as the imbecile youth of a fallen nation. Yet a question is left for us to contemplate. If the portrait that Stephen had been part of for so long has now been a mere object to commentate on, how would the now not so apparently visible identity of Stephen look like? To this we will all be drawing our own scribbles of the portrait of the artist, reckoning that even he who declares independence from the oppressive structure cannot be liberated from it, just as a critique lives among the realm of social entities to criticize. From the flaunting Renaissance to the postmodern caricature, the image of Stephen Dedalus fluctuates in order to escape the arts of ideology, but he remains in infinite exile waiting to be recaptured by yet another structure.